Hello everyone. This video will serve as an expansion to my previous performance guide to show in-game real-time performance metrics between the EVGA Black RTX 2070 Super and the RTX 3080 Founders Edition. I have selected two means of showing these metrics. I will be showing raw 1440p ultra footage of both cards, as well as my own personal low settings on both cards. It is important to note that ultra will be again taken at 1440p while my low settings are played at 1080p. The game will be benched on my personal rig, which holds an i7 9700K at 5GHz all cores and 16GB of DDR4 4000MHz CL15 RAM. This is to limit potential CPU bottlenecks that may occur, which holds more true to the 1440p benchmarks than the 1080p benchmarks. To further show transparency that took place in testing, I used the same NVIDIA control panel settings in my previous video with one exception. I turned off ultra low latency. To begin our testing, I want to showcase 1440p raw ultra performance between both cards. I stripped the game of my custom INI and allowed it to create its own brand new INI file. I then maxed every setting, and the only changes I made were my sensitivities. Here, you can see the RTX 3080 handling a 96 plus player fight on Indar. Our lowest FPS dip was 98 FPS, and in terms of input latency, which is subjective, it felt close to how the game feels at my lower custom settings. Now we have the EVGA Black RTX 2070 Super running the same settings at 1440p at a similarly sized fight. Our lowest FPS value was 65 FPS, while frame time struggled to stay below 10 milliseconds on average. Input latency was also a major issue, as the mouse felt sluggish, and as though it had unnecessary weight added to my tracking when switching between targets. To sum up our 1440p ultra settings comparison, the RTX 3080 had utilization below 70% for most of the test, and clock speeds managed to stay relatively high at 1965 MHz with little dip. Bear in mind both these cards were running stock configuration with no overclock on either the clock or the memory. The 2070 Super, on the other hand, had utilization well into the 90s and upper 80s, and that could be seen in the video there. Of course, the 3080 maintained frame times below 10 milliseconds on average, while the 2070 Super struggled to maintain 10 milliseconds or below during its testing. And when it comes to frame rate, the 3080 is also crowned here with FPS above 100 during most of the testing, while 2070 Super struggled to maintain 100 FPS at any time. Obviously, this is due to different architectures and things like that, and I'll go into that at the end of the video. We will also head into our next test, which will be my own personal custom settings at 1080p. To begin, for reference, my custom INI will be in the video description. I went into detail regarding the Useroptions.ini in my previous video, so go watch that for more specific information regarding my settings. Beginning with the RTX 3080, you will see throughout the video that we maintain well above 200 frames per second on average, with our low being 205 frames per second. Frame times also managed to stay relatively low, with our high hitting 8 milliseconds and our average being around 4 or 5 milliseconds. Now, with the 2070 Super, you can see we maintain, again, well above 200 frames per second, and we even peak into the 300 plus FPS limit, with our low being about 248 FPS. The 2070 Super managed to pull frame times down on average below 5 milliseconds, with our high being 5.5 milliseconds. It's important to note that this fight did have about 10 to 20% less people in it than the 3080 test, and it was on a different continent, but the settings are the same. Planetside is very hard to replicate similar situations at all times. To conclude our 1080p segment, it is very important to note that 1080p is what actually limits our GPUs in regards to performance. You need to have a solid baseline, which includes a solid CPU and decent RAM to perform these tests and remove as much CPU bottleneck as possible. The 1080p segment resulted in nearly mirrored performance between both cards, with the 2070 Super in this test actually pulling forward a bit due to population and base differences. Both the 3080 and the 2070 Super had utilization well below 50% compared to my 1440p tests, where the 2070 Super was nearly maxed out. In conclusion, this video was made because I dislike seeing videos posted in the community that show the new GPUs in action, but have no substance to them. People run different setups, that's what makes PC gaming so great, but seeing someone run a RTX 3090 in a rig with an 8700K will not give you any reason to purchase or ignore these cards. In my opinion, after testing concluded, I would say unless you play other games and have a rig where you absolutely need to upgrade to an RTX 3080 for a specific game or application, I would not upgrade my GPU for Planetside 2 alone. I would focus more on my CPU and RAM and let the GPU follow. Planetside 2 relies heavily on CPU clock speeds and RAM speeds. You can easily gain 50 FPS or more by simply upgrading your RAM kit from 2666 MHz to 3600 MHz or 4000 MHz. Even by overclocking your CPU, you can achieve a reasonable amount of FPS. This is all up to you. As a consumer, however, the RTX 3080 does improve 1440p performance on Ultra and feels much more playable than an RTX 2070 Super does running on the same settings. But 1080p performance justifies that a 2070 Super performs just as well as a 3080 will. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.